At 2:24 a.m. in the Strait of Hormuz, the radar screens aboard a U.S. destroyer light up with dozens of fast-moving contacts emerging from the Iranian coastline at almost the same moment. A Chinese supertanker is pushing directly toward the blockade line. Behind it, IRGC swarm boats begin spreading out, breaking formation like predators moving in coordinated silence. Inside the CIC, warning tones echo across the room. Farther out in the Arabian Sea, U.S. radar picks up faint, unstable signals on the outer edge of the battlespace. They are too unclear to confirm as deployed forces and not solid enough to identify as active ISR support. The U.S. Navy is maintaining a maritime blockade in Hormuz, using pressure against Iran after a major escalation in the region. The Chinese supertanker, loaded with strategic oil, attempts to push through the blockade with support from the PLA Navy and backing from Iran. Beijing is not looking for a full confrontation with the U.S. Navy. Its goal is simpler: create enough pressure, confusion, and hesitation for the tanker to slip out of Hormuz. Out in the Arabian Sea, the U.S. carrier strike group remains under strict radio silence. At the same time, Iranian radar operators continue watching weak signals appear and disappear along the edges of the engagement zone. China positions a Type 052D destroyer east of the Strait of Hormuz, using long-range radar coverage and missile presence to force the U.S. Navy to stretch its blockade formation wider than planned. At 2:30 a.m., IRGC units along the Iranian coastline deploy patrol boat teams, reconnaissance drones, and one-way unmanned systems from multiple coastal launch points. The goal is to overload the entire U.S. coastal sensor network at once. An American Arleigh Burke Flight 3 destroyer moves into the blockade zone and immediately shifts to full alert. Aegis activates multi-target tracking inside a heavily disrupted electronic environment. Above the water, P-8 Poseidons and MQ-9 Reapers establish a real-time ISR network, feeding constant updates on the tanker's position and the movement of the swarm groups. An MH-60R Seahawk lifts off and begins shadowing the oil tanker from long range, providing early warning and an extra layer of surveillance. Both sides continue issuing radio warnings. Neither side changes course. The Chinese supertanker keeps moving deeper into the blockade line. At this point, one miscalculation could turn Hormuz from a pressure campaign into an open confrontation. Then an Iranian Ababel 3 drone ignores repeated warnings and crosses directly into the 5 nautical mile security perimeter around the Arleigh Burke Flight 3 destroyer. Rules of engagement activate instantly. A short burst from the Mark 38 25mm cannon strikes the drone, scattering carbon fiber debris across the air. Within seconds, the Chinese Type 052 destroyer switches its Type 346 AESA radar from search mode into combat tracking mode, locking directly onto the American warship. That active electronic pressure gives IRGC coastal missile batteries enough targeting data to respond. Moments later, 2 C-82 anti-ship cruise missiles launch from the coast. Inside the CIC, operators begin calling out over one another as the Spy-6 display floods with new red tracks appearing all at once. At 2:43 a.m., the Aegis combat system takes control and begins calculating intercept solutions against the incoming C-82s. The Burke reacts instantly, launching 2 SM-6 interceptors from its Mark 41 vertical launch system. Seconds later, the night sky above Hormuz flashes with bright bursts as the SM-6s reach the incoming targets at altitude and remove them from the fight before they can close the distance. ESSM missiles remain ready in reserve, prepared to engage anything that slips through the first defensive layer. On deck, the Phalanx CIWS spins into position, its 20mm Vulcan cannon tracking continuously for any threat entering the final approach zone. High overhead F/A 18 Super Hornets from the distant carrier strike group arrive in the battle space, but they do not fire. Instead, they drop low over the water, executing aggressive high-speed passes across the surface. The pressure waves from the flybys roll across the sea around the swarm boats, breaking their rhythm and forcing crews to react. At the same time, the fighters release flares and countermeasures, disrupting IRGC units carrying shoulder-fired air defense systems and complicating their ability to track targets. Iran answers by sending forward waves of Shahed drones and rocket-armed fast boats. But the U.S. Navy has already brought another layer into play: SEWIP Block 3. SEWIP Block 3 begins interfering with Iranian drone data links in focused, localized clusters. It does not shut down the entire battlefield at once. Instead, it targets specific sectors, weakening coordination piece by piece. Several drone groups begin losing synchronization, their formations drift, their timing breaks apart, and some drop out of the fight entirely, falling into the water before reaching the destroyer. The outer edges of the swarm start to collapse. But the Chinese tanker, protected by the electronic cover of the PLA Navy destroyer, continues its dangerous push through Hormuz. At 2:50 a.m., the situation becomes even more unstable. A second Chinese Type 052D destroyer appears from the southern side of the strait, moving close along the port side of the tanker. The formation is now tighter, more deliberate, and far more difficult to contain. To increase pressure, China launches J-15 Flying Shark fighters from a nearby carrier group. Their mission is not to engage directly, but to shadow U.S. operations and force American commanders to divide their attention. With two PLA Navy destroyers broadcasting powerful radar interference, the battlespace becomes increasingly distorted. Then the IRGC begins its first true saturation push. A dense wave of swarm drones, high-speed missile boats, and sea-skimming C-82 missiles floods toward the Burke's sensor picture. Within seconds, the American CIC no longer sees a clean battlefield. Instead, the displays show layers of overlapping contacts stacked so tightly together that separating real threats from distractions becomes almost impossible. At 2:56 a.m., under the pressure of the saturation wave, the defensive screen begins to strain. SM-6 interceptors and the CIWS manage to stop most of the incoming threats. But one Iranian one-way drone, launched from a civilian fishing vessel to hide its origin, slips past the outer defense layer. The drone breaks through the outer air defense screen and detonates near the destroyer's superstructure. The blast damages satellite communication antennas and tactical data links, partially cutting the USS Burke off from the wider fleet network. China immediately takes advantage of the disruption. Using the communications gap and the electronic cover provided by the PLA Navy destroyers, the Chinese tanker shuts down its AIS transponder and accelerates toward the opening inside the blockade line. The U.S. Navy network struggles to resynchronize. While the Burke remains focused on damage control and holding back the remaining missile boats, the Chinese supertanker begins racing toward the open waters of the Arabian Sea. Every second now pushes the blockade closer to a complete breakdown. At 3:05 a.m., the crisis reaches its breaking point. The American blockade line is barely holding. Seeing that the Arleigh Burke Flight 3 destroyer is dealing with internal damage and a temporary communications disruption, the Chinese Type 052D destroyer positioned near the mouth of the strait makes its move. Its objective is clear: secure an escape corridor for the tanker. The destroyer launches a pair of YJ-18 supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles. These systems are especially difficult to counter. They travel at lower speed during the cruise phase to conserve energy, then rapidly accelerate to nearly Mach 3 as they close in during the final stage. The launch is a calculated pressure move. It is meant to force the American destroyer into urgent defensive maneuvers, pulling it away from the tanker's escape path and opening the corridor even wider. Soviet Block 3 shifts into an optimized defensive mode, disrupting Iranian battlefield coordination sector by sector. Instead of overwhelming the entire network at once, it weakens key links in the chain, slowly breaking down tactical cohesion across the swarm. At 3:17 a.m., while the surface confrontation continues below, an MQ-9 Reaper holds position at a careful distance, staying outside the reach of Iranian coastal air defense systems such as the Khordad-15. Using its MTSB multispectral targeting system, the Reaper cuts through the smoke from burning oil, heavy haze, and electronic interference across the strait. Then it finds what the fleet needs most: the thermal signature of the Chinese supertanker as it attempts to slip through the opening in the blockade line. The Reaper immediately begins sending high-resolution ISR data to an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye operating nearly 100 miles away. The Hawkeye becomes the airborne battle manager. Using the incoming data, it begins rebuilding the fractured tactical network. By bypassing disrupted satellite communication arrays and shifting traffic onto secure anti-jam link 16 channels, the U.S. Navy starts restoring the common operational picture. The attempt to isolate the Burke begins to fail as the fleet's digital command structure comes back online. The saturation push that once overwhelmed the American defenses now starts losing momentum under the restored network. Then the weak electronic signals detected earlier in the Arabian Sea finally reveal their true purpose. Emerging from the darkness, F-35C, Lightning II stealth fighters from the Carrier Strike Group officially enter the battle space. Unlike conventional fighters, the F-35Cs do not announce themselves with obvious radar signatures. Their AN/APG-81 AESA radars operate in low probability of intercept mode, making them extremely difficult for Iranian and Chinese sensors to track. The real advantage of the F-35C is not just stealth, it is fusion. The aircraft pulls data from the MQ-9, P-8, E-2D, and the Burke, combining all of it into a single coordinated targeting network. Iranian radar operators see only brief ghost signals flashing across their screens before disappearing back into the background noise. No stable track lasts long enough to build a reliable lock. At 3:25 a.m., the United States shifts from emergency defense into a coordinated counteroffensive. The Burke uses its remaining SM-6 missiles for long-range interception, while MH-60R Seahawks move into cleanup operations along the outer edges of the blockade line. Using Hellfire missiles, the helicopters begin disabling Iranian swarm boats that are still trying to pressure the perimeter. The F-35Cs now act as forward sensor and targeting nodes, feeding ultra-precise data to U.S. aircraft waiting beyond the horizon. From a safer distance, F/A-18E Super Hornets launch AGM-158CLR ASM missiles, guided by the stealth fighters operating closer to the battlespace. The missiles use advanced autonomous targeting to slip through the PLAN defensive network and focus on the command and control systems of the lead Type 052D destroyer. One LRASM strikes the destroyer's primary radar array, disabling its ability to continue shielding the tanker. The entire situation shifts in seconds. Faced with the sudden arrival of stealth aircraft and a collapsing attack network, the IRGC swarm begins pulling back toward the coastline in disorder. At the same time, the PLAN escort ships are forced to move away toward the Gulf of Oman to protect their remaining vessels. At 3:40 a.m., the lead Chinese Type 052D destroyer is still trailing smoke from its damaged radar system. With its main sensor array offline, the ship is forced into an emergency defensive posture. Its combat coordination capability is no longer effective. The destroyer can no longer provide the electronic cover needed to protect the tanker. And for Beijing, the risk has changed completely. What was supposed to remain a gray zone pressure operation is now turning into a direct confrontation with far higher costs. To avoid losing a multi-billion-dollar asset, Plan Command orders a tactical withdrawal. The second Type 052D releases multispectral smoke screens and active decoys, covering the damaged destroyer as both vessels turn away from the blockade line and begin retreating toward the deeper waters of the Gulf of Oman. Beijing's gamble on a fast, high-pressure breakthrough has failed. At the same time, Iran's IRGC assault begins to fall apart, with drone data links disrupted by SE-Dayep Block 3 and fast attack boats being picked off by Hellfire missiles from MH-60R Seahawks. The remaining swarm units lose formation and coordination. What once looked like a synchronized shark fin attack pattern now turns into a disorderly retreat back toward the Iranian coastline near Bandar Abbas. The sky, once crowded with Shahed drones, is now filled with scattered debris, smoke trails, and fuel fires fading over the water. Above the battlespace, MQ-9 Reapers and P-8 Poseidons maintain constant surveillance. Every retreating vessel is tracked. Every movement is watched. Any renewed aggressive action would be answered immediately. Then the Chinese supertanker, left exposed in the middle of the strait, finally has no option but to yield. With the planned radar shield gone and the IRGC escort screen broken apart, the massive vessel powers down its engines. It drifts motionless on the water, surrounded by oil slicks, scattered wreckage, and the dark silhouette of the Arleigh Burke Flight 3 destroyer. Despite damage to its superstructure, the American warship still holds position. Its Mark 45 5-inch main gun remains trained directly on the tanker's bridge. At 4 a.m., the U.S. Navy reestablishes control over the maritime corridor. The blockade is no longer uncertain. It is now fully enforced. The high-risk attempt to break the regional order ends quietly across the waters of Hormuz. But the bigger question remains. What if China had never deployed the Type 052Ds to support the tanker? What if Iran had been left to act alone, without planned radar pressure, along the edge of Hormuz? In that scenario, Iran's swarm attack would likely have been broken much earlier by Aegis, US ISR coverage, and layered naval defenses. The tanker would have been isolated before any real opening in the blockade could appear. But there is another side to the question. What if Washington had abandoned escalation control from the beginning? F-35Cs, Super Hornets, and Tomahawks could have turned a containment operation into a much wider military campaign within minutes. And once a planned destroyer was mission disabled, the crisis would no longer remain contained inside Hormuz. Oil markets, Gulf shipping routes, and regional militaries would all be pulled dangerously close to a wider confrontation. Because in Hormuz, the real danger was never whether the U.S. Navy had the ability to respond. The real danger was how far it was willing to go before the entire region crossed the point of no return.